on the ballot is through an initiative. An initiative is a change proposed by citizens who collect enough voter signatures to get on the ballot. So Props 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, these are all initiatives, and 31 is a referendum, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, so here's our first one. Proposition 1. So this is about reproductive freedom. It was placed on the ballot by the legislature, and it would change the California Constitution. So what's the background here? In June of 2022, the US Supreme Court ended the federal constitutional right to abortion, and there is concern that the right to contraception may be under similar threat. Abortion is legal under the California state law today, and this proposition does not change the law. There's also a California Supreme Court case which holds that the state's constitution's right to privacy extends to an individual's decision about whether or not to have an abortion. So what would be the effect? If it passes, Prop 1 would add the right to an abortion or contraception to the California Constitution, and that would make it harder for a future state government to change the law to limit reproductive rights, or a future California court to overturn existing law. And there's no budget effects estimated for Prop 1. What we typically do for each of these propositions is have what we consider a money slide. So this really tells you what the supporters have put into it versus the opponents. The signatories, any signatories to the proposition are noted in bold. And $3 signs means the contribution is in the millions. If you've got $2 signs, that's hundreds of thousands, and a single dollar sign is a less than 100,000. And I will just give you a few seconds just to look at the supporters and the opponents. Again, it's 9 million for and less than about 100,000 opposed. All right, so reasons to support. Supporters say, again, this would name reproductive freedom as a right in the California Constitution, and that it would keep reproductive medical decisions where they belong, with individuals and their healthcare providers. Reasons to oppose: opponents say women already have the right to choose under current California law, and so it's not needed to protect women's health or their reproductive rights. Also, you may not support reproductive freedom as a right, which would be a reason to oppose it. So propositions, going on to the next one, propositions 26 and 27 are two measures on additional forms of gambling. So let's start with the first one. So proposition 26 allows in-person roulette, dice, and sports betting. It is an initiative, and it would change both the Constitution and the law. So what's the background here? At present, California does not allow sports betting, roulette, or games with dice. Gambling in California is limited. Oops, my apologies. Sorry about that. All right. Gambling in California is limited to 4 things. We've got the state lottery, we've got card rooms, we've got horse race betting, and tribal casinos. So Native American tribes have agreements with the state to offer gambling, and this raises revenue to help lift Indian tribes out of poverty by creating jobs and providing services such as education, healthcare, and housing, while also bringing in additional revenue for state and local government. What would Prop 26 do? It would allow additional gambling in 2 ways. One would be in-person sports betting to those over 21 at racetracks and tribal casinos, and the second would be additional gambling like roulette at tribal casinos. What would the fiscal effects be? Increased state revenues, possibly tens of millions of dollars annually, even with the increased state cost to enforce and regulate the new law. The money slide, again, we have a significant amount of money in this proposition, about 112 million in support, raised mostly or contributed mostly by 5 California Indian tribes. We have 42 million against, again, contributed mostly by 6 non-tribal card rooms. And again, just give you a minute to look at that. Reasons to support. Additional revenues would help Indian tribes provide vital services to their members. Supporters also say sports betting will be in person, which will provide safeguards against underage gambling. Opponents point out that this additional gambling expands the monopoly and only benefits tribal casinos, and gambling is addictive. Legalizing more types of gambling is bad for public health and safety. The second of our gambling propositions is Prop 27, which would allow online sports betting, and it is also an initiative which would change the constitution and the law. So what's the background here? Betting on horse racing became legal in 1933. It was a while ago, but in 2018, the US Supreme Court said that states could legalize sports betting, and 33 states around the country have done that, and Americans bet about $60 billion a year. Sports betting is not legal in California. Prop 27 would change that. So it would legalize online sports betting, as well as betting on some non-athletic events like award shows and current events. No betting would be allowed on youth sports or elections, and the betting would be offered by Indian tribes and gambling companies that contract with them. The fiscal effects are pretty significant. 10% of the gambling profits would go to the state, so the increased state revenues could be hundreds of millions of dollars, even though there will be increased states' costs to enforce and regulate the law. The increased state revenues would first be used to pay for state regulatory costs, and then 85% to support programs to alleviate homelessness, mental health and addiction, and then 15% to tribes that are not directly involved in online sports betting. Again, a significant amount of money for and against. The money for is, for the most part, through the national online gaming companies. BetMGM, FanDuel, DraftKings are some big ones. And the money against is, again, for the most part, by five California Indian tribes. 169 million for, 228 million against. I think it goes down as maybe one of the most expensive props in California history. All right, reasons to support. More money would be available to support programs to alleviate homelessness, mental health, and addiction. This may also be advantageous to some of the smaller Indian tribes that don't own big casinos. Reasons to oppose. This would benefit large gaming companies and block smaller operations, because eligible companies must be licensed in 10 states and pay $100 million for a California license. And online sports betting makes gambling more accessible. Our next proposition is Prop 28, about more dollars for art and music in schools. Again, it's an initiative and it would change the law. So what's the background here? Thanks to Prop 98, which was passed in 1988, the state is required to spend a minimum amount on K through 14 education, which is kindergarten through 2-year community college. This minimum guarantee is calculated annually. It's about 40%. But there's no guaranteed source of funding for art and music education in K through 12 public schools. State law does require schools to provide arts and music instruction to all students in grades 1 through 6. And there are high school graduation requirements that students must complete 1 year in one of 3 courses of study, one of which is arts and music. So beyond these, the other specifics, such as the amount of education, when courses are offered, are all determined by the local governing board. So what is the effect of Prop 28? It would require that funding for arts and music be at least 1% of the funding received by schools the prior year under Prop 98. And this funding would be in addition to the funding already guaranteed under Prop 98. And this proposition would also allocate more funding to schools serving many low-income students. What are the fiscal effects? It would be increased state expenses, about $1 billion each year, which would come out of the state general fund. Who's supporting and against it? We have about $10 million in support, none reported against. And you see the supporters on the left. Reasons to support: art and music's education can improve a student's personal life and academic life. and only 1 in 5 schools have a dedicated teacher for the arts program. Reasons to oppose. Opponents are not arguing that more money for arts and music in schools would be bad. Their concerns are budgetary. Prop 28 would limit the state funds available for other spending, and setting aside funds for specific programs limits flexibility to spend on the highest needs. Our next proposition is Prop 29, which is around more regulations for kidney dialysis clinics. And again, this is an initiative that would seeks to change the law. You've seen this before, similar propositions. There was Prop 8 in 2018, Prop 23 in 2020. They were supported by SEIU, which is a labor union attempting to unionize healthcare workers at dialysis clinics. The states, more background, the state's 2 largest dialysis businesses are DaVita and Fresenius, and they operate almost 3/4 of the clinics, the dialysis clinics in California. More background, there are federal regulations on how these clinics operate around, doctors' visits and reporting infection rates. And dialysis is administered by trained technicians, while the clinic is supervised by a registered nurse. So what would Prop 29 do? It would impose several requirements for clinics. One, they must have at least 1 doctor, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant present during all treatment hours. So it would up the level of certification for the supervision. Telehealth may be used for up to 1 year to fulfill this requirement. Clinics must support any dialysis-related infections to the state every 3 months. They must disclose who owns the clinic to patients. They need permission from the state before closing or reducing services, and they can't refuse to treat patients based on how they're paying for the treatment. So what are the fiscal effects? The clinics would probably have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars more annually for staff salaries. And so if that forces clinics to close and patients go to more expensive facilities such as emergency rooms, or if clinics negotiate higher reimbursement rates, state and local governments might have to pay tens of millions of dollars more annually. What does our money slide say? We've got 8 million for, and we've got a significant amount against. And against is, again, from the 2 main dialysis providers. Again, I'll just give you a few seconds to look at the other supporters and opponents. Reasons to support. This would upgrade the professional level of the on-site healthcare manager to a doctor, a nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant, and that would be good in an emergency. The prop would also prevent financial discrimination based on the type of insurance one uses, whether it's Medi-Cal, Medicare, or private insurance. Reasons to oppose. Currently, dialysis clinics must have a registered nurse on site for emergencies. Upgrading that may cause some dialysis clinics in the state to close due to increased costs. Opponents again say dialysis is administered by specially trained technicians, and additional requirements could take healthcare providers away from hospitals and emergency rooms where they are needed more. So we are down to our last 2 states. We've got Prop 30, which is a tax on millionaires for more electric cars. And this is an initiative which would look to change the law. So background here. California has a number of zero emission mandates that 35% of the cars are zero emission vehicles or ZEVs by 2026, 100% by 2035. The state is also requiring rideshare companies such as Uber and Lyft to have 90% of their drivers driving ZEVs by 2030. Both the federal and the state governments have committed billions of dollars in tax credits and other efforts to speed up the adoption of ZEVs. And California itself has budgeted about $10 million over the next 5 years. What Prop 30 would do is to increase the income tax rate on high individual incomes to raise money to be spent as follows: 45% to promote the purchase of ZEVs through rebates and incentives, 35% to increase the availability of electric charging stations, and 20% to help fund wildfire suppression and prevention. What are the fiscal effects? Increasing the income tax rate by 1.75% on individuals who make over $2 million would generate about 3.5 to 5 billion, and that would amount to about 2.8 to 4 billion annually for ZEV funding and about $1 billion annually for wildfire response. Against supporters and opponents, again, a significant amount of money for 47 million, a significant amount of that is from LIFT. And you see 13 million against, and again, I'll just give you a few seconds to look over the supporters and opponents. Reasons to support. Greenhouse gas emissions from cars and other transportation are among the largest contributors to climate change, and this prop would help make ZEVs more affordable and so more widely adopted. Reasons to oppose. The state and federal government are already spending billions of dollars to speed up the adoption of ZEVs. High-income earners may leave the state, as then California would have the highest income tax rate, which would be 15.05% for incomes over 2 million. And opponents again say this would lock in money. The money raised by this tax increase would be locked in. It could not be used for other needs such as school funding, and it would be limited to this proposition only. So our last California proposition is a referendum banning flavored tobacco products. And what's the background here? In 2020, a law was passed to ban stores and vending machines from selling flavored tobacco products. Flavors like fruit, menthol, chocolate can mask or enhance the taste of tobacco. The law was immediately challenged and it's on hold. So this proposition is a referendum on the law. So the law will go into effect only if voters approve this proposition. And the fiscal effects are reduced state tobacco tax revenues, which could range from tens of millions of dollars to 100 million annually. Dollars for and against, about 6 million for, about 23 million against. And you can see the supporters and opponents here. Reasons to support. Flavored tobacco products can lure middle and high school students into a lifelong addiction to nicotine. Flavored tobacco products can also make it hard to quit smoking, even though tobacco use is linked to increased rates of heart disease, stroke, and cancer. Reasons to oppose. Opponents say it's already illegal to sell tobacco products to anyone under the age of 21, so a total prohibition is not necessary to keep tobacco from youth. And criminalizing the sale of menthol cigarettes will impact minority communities more, and it may lead to more smuggling and crime. So then very quickly, we have one measure from Alameda County, and this is Measure D around agriculture and open space lands. So the background here is Measure D was passed back in 2000 to set ratios of agricultural buildings and horse arenas, the ratio of the buildings to land in unincorporated areas of Alameda County. And what was written into the measure is that any change requires a vote by county residents. And so the measure is coming back up again because there's a change in the ratio of agricultural buildings and equestrian arenas relative to the total land area to allow expansion. Again, this was placed on the ballot by the Board of Supervisors after a significant number of public meetings. And again, it has some support and no formally registered opposition. So I am actually going to stop there and open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anna. That was a great overview, and we got some great questions in the chat. So I'll let you know what those are, and hopefully you can address them. Actually got one question about an Oakland measure. Maybe we'll save that for the next section. And a copy about getting the slides. So you probably saw that we are recording the session, and so we'll make that available, and then maybe we can discuss offline if we could also make your slides available to the audience. So on to the props. For Prop 26, and I was interested in this too, which sports could be bet on? Do you have any more you can share on when we talk about sports betting, just sort of what that encompasses?
Right, so that's pretty much anything. I mean, it could be, football games, baseball, anything that, today you typically would go to Vegas or someplace to space sports bet. So nothing is off bounds. Youth sports are off bounds, just, from the point of view of corruption, but anything else that anyone wants to bet on is fair game.
Great.
$60 billion. People spend a lot of money on sports betting, evidently.
Yeah, that is a lot. Great, thank you. Kind of jumping to Prop 29. How do SIEU interests, the union, how are those interests served by the proposition? Doctors, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants aren't in unions, are they? So I think it's about the support of that prop by the union.
Right. So the union is basically trying to unionize the workers at the clinic. So I think there's sort of a back and forth between that. And I think there's been kind of measures, steps to kind of bring both sides to the table outside of these propositions to resolve, their efforts, but they seem to have failed. And so SEIU has brought a number of these measures to the props before in past years also. Not sure if that quite answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Thank you.
Gail, did you have a comment? Also, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, judging from commentary among the journalists, the idea is that SEIU is trying to force the dialysis clinics to spend the money, the considerable amounts of money that you see that they mount to oppose these measures. And so the idea is at some point in time, they'll be tired of spending money opposing these measures and instead be willing to, as Anna said, come to the table and negotiate unionization.
Thanks, Gail.
Great. The next question, I think I have the same question. I remain confused by the differences between Prop 26 and 27. The ads continue to confuse. I agree with that. Can you shed a little bit more light on maybe just the difference between those two props?
Right. So 27 is solely about online sports betting. So there's parts, so online sports betting. And so that would be from anywhere, right? You go on a tablet, you go on the internet from anywhere. That would allow online sports betting. Prop 26 is about expanding that kind of betting, but within tribal casinos, within racetracks, certain specific areas. So it's kind of, in some ways, you can think of it as geography. Would you be able to do it from anywhere? Would you have to go to specific locations to do it? That helps.
And for both of those props, is the money going to the same, like staying in California? I think that's one of the other confusing parts of the at least the ads we're seeing online, is who's benefiting from the gambling. Right.
So the Prop 26, the biggest beneficiary in terms of the revenue, before it goes to the state and so on and so forth, are the California Indian tribes, because they are the ones who have historically been able to offer gambling and they will continue to do so. In Prop 27, the national gaming companies, like your, forgetting the names, the national gaming companies would have to still contract with a California tribe to offer it, but then there'd be a larger amount of revenue that they would get also as a part of it.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll try and get through a few more here. Can you please explain the difference again between proposition and referendum?
Right, so a proposition is something that either the legislature or comes from voters. It's something new that's being brought to the table to be made, to be added to the Constitution or to be added or to make a law around it. A referendum is when the California legislature has already passed a law. So for example, in this case, they passed the law banning flavored tobacco products, and the tobacco companies immediately collected enough votes to put it on the ballot. And so even though the legislature passed the law, it's now on the ballot and as a referendum, and only if voters approve this referendum will the law go into effect. So referendum is on an existing law. And last time around, there was one on bail, if I remember. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. But this time around, it's on flavored tobacco products.
Great, thank you. Can you give more explanation around the Alameda County Prop D? What is the current ratio and how would it change?
Ooh, I am sorry. I do not, what I will do is I do not have the number. So let me, while, Gail starts to present on the local, I'll have to look up the number. I don't have that. My apologies.
Okay, no worries.
And it has to do with sort of expansion of using sort of a higher ratio, if you will, for facilities to land, but I can't tell you. I'll look up what the exact ratio is.
Mhm. I'm not, and I'll just add that I think the numbers are a little bit hard to translate into anything, but what I think of is in some of the uses that people are saying that in order to have a really functional equestrian space and accommodate enough people to make the situation viable, or for some of the agricultural properties to be able to put on tasting rooms, either for wine or products like olive oil. Those are the arguments for increasing somewhat the size of certain facilities. And the opponents are saying basically the whole thing here was to maintain open space. That's why they made it so rigid and required that they have to bring the matter back to the voters to institute any changes whatsoever.
Great. Okay, maybe we'll do one more question and then move on, but we can hopefully come back as well to get to the rest of the questions if there's time at the end. So can you provide some historical background on Prop 29? My recollection is that related measures have lost in the past, which seems surprising. What is your understanding of the reason for that?
I'm not sure I can speculate on the reason, but I can tell. I was just trying to find my numbers on.
There's sort of a related question around, like, are there a lot of problems at dialysis clinics? I think this is sort of, again, my guess is we see this prop continually come up year after year. So I think just, yeah, if there's any insight on.
Yeah, so just a little bit of history. So Prop 8, which is 2018, was defeated by a vote of 60 to 40%. And then Prop 23, which was in 2020, was defeated by a vote of 63 to 37%. So it seems to be trending the other way. I'm not sure I can say anything more other than I think dialysis, there's just a huge number of patients in dialysis, right? About 80,000 Californians undergo dialysis every year. So there's a number of these clinics. It's something that a lot of people do. There's a lot of money in it around Medi-Cal and Medicare. It seems to be pretty well regulated from what I see from a federal and other perspective, but the union clearly has another opinion on it. And Gail, I'm not sure if there's anything else you can add on that.
No, I think that, that we don't see like mounting evidence and, as to why the rationale that we've put before you that we're repeating from the commentators is that basically it has more to do with labor relations than a lot of statistics around what's going on in the dialysis clinics, because we haven't seen a lot of statistics coming forward for that.
Makes sense. Okay, great. Well, there's a few more questions about the state props, but why don't we go ahead and move on just for the sake of time. Gail, to the California, or sorry, the local measures, and then we can always come back, time permitting.
Okay, I'm going to begin sharing screen then, Heather. Great. Okay, everyone okay with seeing my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So we're on to the Oakland ballot measures. And I'd like to start by just taking a moment to answer the question as to how these measures wind up on your ballot. In this case, this year, most of them were introduced by the city council. They were debated, therefore, in open public meetings and voted to the ballot by a majority of city council members. There is one parcel tax that was put on the ballot by the Oakland Unified School District, and that entailed a similar public process, including discussion in open meetings and a majority vote among the school board directors to put it on the ballot. The final measure is the second parcel tax, which came to us via the initiative process because its supporters gathered sufficient signatures to qualify it for the ballot. So to talk about these measures, I'm going to group them and start with the 5 measures that concern city finances. We'll begin with Measure U, the infrastructure bond. Notice that this takes a 2/3 vote to pass. Bonds are a city's way of borrowing money to finance large capital expenditures. They have a rolling life cycle that can easily last 5 to 10 years. The cycle includes multiple stages. This measure concerns the first stage and asks us to authorize a certain amount of indebtedness. However, it doesn't mean that Oakland is immediately going to take on that debt. Even if the measure is passed, the authorizations would be used to issue bonds in slices or what they call tranches, some money at a time. After that, projects would be planned and approved and completed, often over the course of years. And repayment would occur in compliance with the interest rates and the timetable that were negotiated for each slice of bonds. Let's take a look at the particulars of Measure U. It can be considered as a successor measure to Measure KK, which we passed in 2016. That was the amount there was $600 million. And you can see that the categories that were covered by Measure KK, that's affordable housing, street paving and reconstruction, and the repair of city facilities, are the same as are proposed for this bond authorization. You've just got a slight difference in some of the terminology, but it's the same. However, the amounts of money in each of these categories differ. If you notice in 2016, the affordable housing stream of money that was approved was only 100 million. And now that is the larger stream of money that's being proposed. So let's look at the effects on the city's ability to undertake infrastructure projects and the effect of this measure on property owners' taxes. Since Measure KK bonds were dedicated to different categories, streets, housing, etc., the most relevant concern is whether any of those are likely to be expended soon. And in fact, one of the categories, the housing category, is one in which there only remains about $1 million. So to proceed with plans for affordable housing, the city will require more authorization to borrow money as projects are developed and implemented. And it will need to do that in part because California is requiring all cities, including Oakland, to develop plans for meeting state targets for housing, including affordable housing. Let's look at the effect on property owners' taxes. And to assess that, you need to know about a policy that the city adopted just this year. It's a debt limitation policy. And the policy is to limit the rate that taxpayers pay to 0.22%, which you can think of as $220 per $100,000 of assessed value. And that's actually the rate that is projected for property owners' tax bill this year. So what application of the policy means going forward is that rates will not go higher than they are now because new tranches of bonds will only be issued as older ones are paid off or as the tax base expands. The reasons to support this are that the bond authorizations will allow the city to address critical housing needs, to consider transportation upgrades, and to repair and upgrade aging facilities. A source of opposition comes from those who are simply unwilling to invest in longer-term infrastructure projects. That's our first measure to do with city finances. This one isn't so closely connected to finance, but it is intimately related to the bond measure. So I want to talk about the two of them together. There's a provision in the California Constitution, which actually may be deleted next year. You may be voting on it next election. That provision still requires that cities have voters' approval to build social or affordable housing, which is defined as housing for low income or very low income people. Measure Q here asks the voters to approve 13,000 affordable housing units. And the reason these two measures go hand in hand is that Oakland needs both authorizations to proceed. It needs Measure U to pass to have money to invest in housing, all sorts of housing, including affordable housing, and it needs these authorizations from the voters in order to spend its money on affordable housing. So I think of this as a hoop that cities must jump through because of a law that is generally believed to be part of a repudiated era of redlining and racism in housing. There's no particular fiscal effect to this passage of this measure. Okay, now let's move on to the second type of measure. So we have a bond measure that we've just discussed, and then we have two parcel taxes that'll be on your ballots. Parcel tax is somewhat different from a bond measure. Here you're paying a fixed amount. Property owners are paying a fixed amount that may include an annual cost of living adjustment. Sometimes that annual adjustment is subject to a cap. The actual amount of a parcel tax can differ among different kinds of properties, with the possibilities of single family dwellings and rental units having different set amounts. And with parcel taxes, commercial properties are often taxed according to their square footage and frontage footage. Parcel taxes last for usually a fixed number of years, and it's money dedicated for a specific purpose. So let's take a look at the two that we have. The first one comes to us is the one that came from the Oakland Unified School District. And it relates to a measure that Oakland voters passed in 2014. That was Measure N. And Measure N imposed a $120 parcel tax that was dedicated to a high school program which developed pathways to careers for high schoolers. Careers included business, education, and healthcare. The high school program was innovative because it integrated high school academics with career-based learning and real-world work experiences. So there were mentorships, there were internships, there were job learnings, there were outside professionals coming to make presentations to the students. That measure, which has been in effect since 2015, will expire in June 2025. It has provided a stable source of approximately $11.5 million in dedicated funding for this program. The impact has been significant, with double-digit improvement in graduation rates for African American and Latinx students. Overall graduation rates increased from about 61% to 73%. And those are on statistics that were taken between June of 2025 up until the beginning of COVID, which was so disruptive from the point of view of both gathering statistics and a lot of other things. So Measure H here asks taxpayers to extend this existing parcel tax for another 14 years at the same rate of $120. There will, however, be annual cost of living adjustments that are capped at 5%. There will be exemptions for seniors and low-income households, and the same accountability measures that are in place now would remain in effect. The reasons to support this, supporters argue that the program has been successful, and that given Prop 13, a parcel tax is one of the only ways to guarantee consistent funding and to secure the program. Those who are in opposition do not contest the success of the program, but argue that we should treat it as a pilot program that has been successful and that now money should come from the Oakland Unified School District's regular budget. The second parcel tax is different in several respects. It's not a request for a continuation of an existing parcel tax. It's a new parcel tax. And it's also distinctive in that it came to us through the initiative process. So maybe you noticed that with the extension of the school parcel tax, a 2/3 vote is required. Whereas here it's a simple majority. And that's because when it's brought through the initiative process, even if it's a tax measure, the simple majority is sufficient for the measure to pass. This is a measure brought by the Oakland, on behalf of the Oakland Zoo. The annual budget of the zoo is currently about $24 million, and it's very fee dependent on entry fees, food, souvenirs, rides for the majority of its revenues. Although the zoo does receive about 8% of its budget from public funding, which comes from Oakland, from Alameda County, from the East Bay Regional Parks District. The Oakland Zoo has about 1 million visitors every year. 15% of those visitors are Oaklanders. So the proposal is that there be a 20-year parcel tax starting in 2023. The amount would be $68 per residential unit. So that would include single-family homes and rental units. That tax would raise approximately $12 million in additional funding, which could be spent, according to the terms of the measure, on any aspect of the zoo's operations or staffing or maintenance or capital improvements. And the provisions of the measure require that Oakland and Alameda County and the East Bay Regional Parks continue the same funding that they have now. So supporters principally argue that this is something that should pass because it would stabilize the zoo's finances, which have been negatively impacted through the last 2 years of COVID. Those who are opposed to it say that only 15% of the zoo's visitors are Oakland residents, yet Oakland property owners would be paying to increase the zoo's revenues for 20 years. Okay, this is the last of those measures that I said related to city finances. So far we're through a bond, we're through two parcel taxes. Those things all apply to all property owners in Oakland. This measure applies simply to businesses. It's a proposed change in Oakland's business tax code. And I should mention at the top that these provisions do not apply to rental properties or to cannabis businesses. However, with respect to all other businesses in Oakland, it would apply. And those businesses pay currently what's known as a flat tax. Businesses are classified into categories such as grocers or hotels and motels, manufacturing concerns, etc. And within each category, all of the businesses in the category pay the same fee per $1,000 of their gross receipts, regardless of how much revenue they earn. Measure T would have the effect of changing the model of the business tax to progressive tax. That would mean that businesses would pay higher rates per $1,000 of their gross receipts as the total of those gross receipts increased. What are the fiscal effects? Well, with respect to the city of Oakland, the effect would be that it would yield an additional $21 to $22 million for the general fund in Oakland. The other effect would be on businesses, clearly. Oakland has about 60,000 small businesses and just over 50 large companies. About 6,000 of the 60,000 small businesses would actually pay less in taxes under Measure T. But companies with administrative headquarters that earn more than 20 million would pay many times what they pay now. Supporters point principally to the process by which this ballot measure came to us. Because if you go back months into last year and even the year before, there were 3 different proposals that were developed. One came from the city council, one came from the business community, one came from a community group. And ultimately, in the interest of sparing all of us trying to decide among 3 different proposals for revisions to the business tax code, they conducted extensive negotiations to back a single compromise measure. And that process actually continued over the course of several years and included debates in the city council, the formation of a blue ribbon task force, and months of additional negotiations once multiple measures had qualified for the ballot. And these supporters say that process should be trusted. Their second reason would be support this because increased tax revenue is very much needed in the city of Oakland. Those who oppose it emphasize what all sides agreed upon, which was that it's quite difficult in any circumstances to predict the impact of changes on the tax code. And that difficulty is amplified in the current climate where the return to work is very unclear. So those who oppose the measure emphasize these concerns by arguing that the tax hike might cause businesses to leave Oakland or to avoid locating here, and businesses may instead choose cities like Berkeley and Pleasanton, which would have lower taxes. Similar concerns cause those who are opposed to argue that tax rates should have been introduced slowly, not all at once, to give time to study the impact and adjust the increases as needed. All right, congratulations. You've made it through the 5 measures on city finances: 1 bond, 2 parcel taxes, and a business tax code revision. We're going to move on to a second group of 3 measures, which I loosely categorize as measures about governance. Measure W is the first of these. And Measure W addresses concerns with money in politics in Oakland. Half the money in Oakland elections comes from outside the city. Only a very small percentage of Oakland residents contribute to candidates. So Measure W would like to change that situation by proposing a new, more comprehensive public financing program for candidates. It also proposes that we have greater transparency about who is funding campaign ads, and it lowers campaign contribution limits to limit the effectiveness of larger donors. Finally, it would enact stricter lobbying rules. So let's take a look at the particulars in this chart where I've tried to outline for you what the situation now under background and what is proposed under the effects side of the chart. So the Public Ethics Commission, Oakland's Public Ethics Commission, declared Oakland's existing limited public financing program inadequate several years ago. Measure W would create a new campaign funding program modeled on a Seattle program. Through this program, registered voters and other eligible residents could receive 4 $25 vouchers. They then could donate this money to candidates of their choice who would be running for mayor, city auditor, city attorney, council member, or school board director, any elective office in Oakland. Candidates who participate in the program would need to limit their total campaign spending and provide campaign spending reports. Measure W would lower the limits for donations to candidates from $900 to $600 for individuals, and for political organizations from $1,800 to $1,200. Measure W would also reduce political influence by restricting lobbying. City officials, former city officials, would be prohibited from lobbying for 2 years rather than the current ban for 1 year. And finally, Measure W would pursue transparency by requiring that the 3 highest contributors to campaign ads be disclosed on all materials supporting or opposing Oakland candidates or measures. The fiscal effects. There's a kind of threefold division into the costs here. There are one-time startup costs of about $700,000. There would be ongoing administrative expenses that are largely connected with additional staff and operations in the Public Ethics Commission, which would manage this program. And then there would be the biennial funding for the democracy dollars, which would be $4 million per 2-year budget cycle. And that funding would be drawn from Oakland's general fund. So supporters of this measure say that Measure W will make elections more fair for candidates who do not have connections to large donors. And they point to the fact that a similar program in Seattle has worked well to increase candidate diversity and has led to greater participation in elections from people across a range of races, ethnicities, ages, and income levels. Those who oppose this say candidates who have connections to large donors may choose not to participate in the program, and they may remain with a large advantage. Those who oppose this measure also argue that this measure will cost too much, and they would prioritize other spending by the city of Oakland. The second governance measure is Measure S, concerns non-citizen voting. So it's a question, you know, not who gets to run and how we support candidates, but who gets to vote. Currently, anyone voting in Oakland has to be an Oakland resident, a US citizen, and at least 18 years old. Non-citizens are not allowed to vote. And that non-citizen category would include legal permanent residents, people with work visas, and undocumented persons. There are over 13,000 non-citizens who send their children to Oakland schools. Now, a similar law has been in effect in San Francisco, as the one proposed here, has been in effect in San Francisco since 2016, which allows the non-citizens to vote in school board elections. Recently, that law was declared unconstitutional, and that decision is now on appeal. So Measure S would like to amend the Oakland City Charter to move towards the type of law that has been in place in San Francisco. After the charter were amended, if this measure were to pass, the city council would still have to pass a law to permit non-citizen residents to vote. That city council law would set the qualifications and criteria of eligibility for non-citizen voters. So this is the first step of what could be a two-step process. Change the charter, then pass what is called an ordinance specifying how the actual voting could take place. So there's no immediate effect, fiscal or otherwise, from this measure passing, because it would require that second step to actually have a real world effect. And those who support this measure say, let's go ahead and take the first step. And they believe allowing non-citizens to vote would promote educational policy that considers the needs of marginalized communities. And they also believe that opening up the vote in this fashion with respect to school board races would encourage wider participation in the civic process. Those who are opposed are concerned that non-citizens would risk significant legal consequences if they overstepped the regulations, even if they did so unintentionally. They are also concerned that implementation will be costly and difficult, as has proven the case in a similar measure. Perhaps you remember voting a couple of years ago to allow youth who are 16 and 17-year-old to vote in school board elections. That measure actually passed, but that group of young people will not be voting in this election because implementation has proved difficult. And that's the third point here of people who oppose this measure, that it's very hard to establish parallel voting systems for groups of voters who are not fully admitted into full voting rights. The third and final governance measure concerns the operations of the city council and city government generally, salaries, procedures, etc. So as you probably know, the Oakland City Council has 8 council members who are elected directly by the people of Oakland. They set goals and priorities for Oakland and approve the city's budget, adopt laws, and appoint members to various boards and commissions. So there are multiple changes to the rules by which they operate. And I've set them up in a chart here because they're so multifarious, it's hard to just describe them broadly and say this is how it goes. So if you move from left to right with me in this chart, you'll see how things would change. So currently, there are no term limits for city council members. They can stay in office for as long as they keep winning re-election. Measure X would limit council members to 3 consecutive terms. However, they would be able to run again after sitting out 1 term. Right now, council members can put measures on the ballot, as they have done this election. Right now, they can do that after only 1 public hearing. If this passes, 2 hearings would be required. Council members also vote on city laws. And when there's a tie, the mayor has the right to cast a deciding vote. Sometimes that hasn't worked so well, according to the people proposing this, because members might be absent or abstain. This would provide that those abstentions, those absences would be counted as no votes to make it clearer when there is a tie and allow the mayor to cast a tie-breaking vote. And right now, the Public Ethics Commission sets the salaries of council members. But if this measure passes, the Public Ethics Commission will set council member salaries as well as those of the city auditor and the city attorney. Right now, our city auditor and city attorney are allowed to support candidates and ballot measures with money, endorsements, and help with campaign activity. If this passes, they would not be able to do that. The measure also would add qualifications for the city auditor and would mandate minimum staffing of 14 for the auditor's office. The fiscal effects are an estimated approximately $858 million, $1,000. And we're throwing such big money around tonight. I'm getting used to talking in the millions, but these are this cost represents mostly the increased staffing costs that are proposed for the city auditor's office. Those who support this measure say this will improve city governance and operations and make officials more responsive, and that the city auditor requires more staff to manage increasing requests for financial and performance audits. Those who oppose it say that reform should be comprehensive, not piecemeal like this, and that some of these measures don't belong, in charter changes. And they also say that bundling disparate reforms together does not give voters the opportunity to vote for particular reforms, but to reject others. All right, 2 to go. You're hanging in there. We're through the money measures, we're through the governance measures, and we have 2 that are unrelated. This one has to do with an existing law in Oakland that is called the Just Cause for Eviction Law. And that's because Oakland requires that you can only evict people if something has happened that's outlined in the law, giving you just cause to do that. The one that is most frequently cited is failure to pay rent. That's a just cause for eviction. The other way that landlords can evict someone or give them a notice of eviction is because they themselves want to occupy the unit, or they need to conduct extensive repairs that are incompatible with residency. And the current law applies to units built through 1995. So this whole eviction protection system only applies to buildings that were completed by 1995. So that's one big change in this effects column here, that the new law would have these rules apply to any buildings older than 10 years. So for this year, that would be all buildings that were completed by 2012. But that would be a rolling date. So each year that passes, another year of older buildings would be brought under the purview of the law. There are also some additional protections extended to people who live in motor vehicles on residential properties. And during the school year, there would be defenses to eviction for tenants who have children or who are school employees, defined as anyone who works on school grounds. Also, tenants would have the right to reclaim residency not just to obtain damages if an owner evicted them, but then did not follow through on occupying the property. Finally, tenants would be free to continue month to month. Under the existing law, it's a cause for eviction if tenants refuse to sign on for another term that is the same as their original lease. Those who support this say that many more tenants will benefit from protections against displacement and eviction, and that school employees and students will be able to avoid disruption during the school year. And those who oppose argue that including more recently built units may discourage new construction and drive up rents. They also are concerned that special tenant protections may discourage landlords from renting to the protected groups and make it more difficult for them to find housing. The final measure, perhaps the simplest, because I know you're probably really tired by now. This one has to do with changing the language in the charter. So it's not going to have a big impact in your life unless you spend a lot of time reading the Oakland City Charter. What it's doing is changing the language from gender specific to gender neutral. Right now, the charter uses words like firemen. It uses pronouns like he and she. The proposed changes would be to replace gender specific words with gender neutral words like firefighters instead of firemen. And the gender neutral pronoun they would be used rather than gendered pronouns. There are no fiscal effects. I just want to let you know, in case you're thinking, I can't even remember what was the first one she started with, that on our website, there's this lovely page called Pros and Cons. And you go there from the home page, you click on the red, you can download a one-pager that is an explanation of each measure. And for the 8 more complex ones, there's a 2 to 3 minute video that you can watch. So if you're like the rest of us and are limited in your ability to retain information, and this certainly would challenge many of us, that resource is there for you. Finally, thank you for coming tonight, giving us this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
That's great. Thanks so much, Gail. That was a great overview of a lot of complex information. And what an awesome resource on your website. I will be checking that out for sure before or as I'm doing my ballot. So thanks so much. We did have a few more questions come in on the local measures. So maybe we'll see if we can get through those, and time permitting can maybe go back to some of the measures Anna described earlier. So we had a question earlier about the Oakland Zoo parcel tax. You may have covered this, but just to go ahead and ask the question, it's 2 parts. Why is a privately funded institution seeking more public funding, and why is it a flat regressive tax? Any insight into the background of that?
So the Oakland Zoo, Oakland owns the Oakland Zoo, okay? And it contracts out the management of the zoo. And there are a number of organizations like the zoo in Oakland that benefit from public monies because they're considered public resources. And that would include places like Chabot, Fairyland, the Oakland Museum, the zoo, and it's part of a municipality's decision that and county decision, frankly, because the monies that are received come from county taxes. They come from our transient occupancy tax in Oakland and from other sources. So it's not unusual for an entity like that to receive public support. There are places, around the country that adopt these kind of parcel taxes in addition to the other public funding that I've just described, because they value these kinds of institutions as resources in the community. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of the question.
No worries. Just why the flat tax versus flat regressive tax?
So some people would argue that all parcel tax. That's just the nature of a parcel tax, right? So it's different, for example, than the bond repayment, which is also paid by property owners. But there, it's a certain amount of money per $100,000 of assessed value. So if your house isn't worth as much, you don't pay as much, right? If your house is worth many millions of dollars, you pay more because it's multiplied by every $100,000 of assessed value. Parcel taxes simply work differently, which is that they are applied to all properties. It's a fixed fee applied to all properties. So people who have properties that are worth less, those who have properties that are worth more are assessed the same fee if they're in that same category of single family dwelling or, you know, rental unit or commercial property. It's the nature of the beast.
Got it. Thank you. A Measure U question. The $220 limit per 100 million, I think it is, home value is collectively, in other words, it's the total local tax bill.
Yes, yes, that's my understanding. So when you have your tax, if you see your tax bill, if you're a property owner, you have a list of all the individual parcel taxes. And then on the other side of your tax bill, I think it's called Oakland 1. Oakland 1, the assessment there is the assessment for all of the bond debt that is being imposed. So right now, Oakland's bond debt includes the Measure KK bonds that haven't been paid off yet. It would include these Measure U bonds. There are certain pension funds. They're all kind of together as the bond debt. And to service that debt, the debt limit says no more than 220 to service that debt. So that means they can't add anything in unless something's falling off, right? Because it's been repaid.
Great, thank you. For Measure H, is the cost of living increase included in the renewal tax? Was it part of the original parcel tax that is being renewed?
When they passed the parcel tax originally, they did not write in an annual cost of living increase. That was actually pretty typical of how things were done at the time. That's no longer the case, whether a parcel measure is asking for renewal or is proposing a new parcel tax. Everyone's copped to the idea that you don't wind up with the same value of money unless you add on a cost of living increase each year. There are two specific indices that they're allowed to use to determine what that cost of living increase will be. Now, some ballot measures say, whatever those indices say, we're capping it at 5%. You can never increase more than 5% each year. Others leave off that cap.
Okay, great. Another Measure T question, why are cannabis businesses excluded?
Cannabis and rental businesses were excluded because the council had more recently, I think 2019, gone over those portions of the business tax code and engaged in extensive debate and revisions. And so they didn't want to do that whole piece again, whereas the rest of the businesses had not been dealt with or had the tax code change as it applied to them for many, many years, decades.
And another Measure T question, how is apportionment handled with this new tax? That is a professional service business that does all its business outside of Oakland, pays only a 30% apportionment today?
I'm going to say I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
So I won't guess.
Okay, fair enough. A couple of questions, or maybe the next question at least, is about the voting, the non-citizen voting measure, I believe. Is it only for school board elections or all city measures or propositions?
No, it's only for school board elections. You know, you're not they would not be voting on any of these propositions. They would not be voting on any Oakland City Council, mayor, anything, only school board.
Great. And we got a question to put your URL in the website. So maybe we could do that, or maybe Jay, you could do that if you haven't done it already, just the League of Women Voters of Oakland. So we can all access your great content. So we'll do that.
Great.
And yes, a couple of thank yous for the amazing presentation. So agree with that for sure. Yeah, not sure if you would be willing to answer this question, but the question is, in the interest of full disclosure, can you tell us what propositions the league does support and doesn't support, or is there information about that on your website? I know you said there were two different kind of separate arms of the organization.
Oh, you're like a plant. That must be somebody, you know, from my organization asking that question. I love it. So thank you very much. Yes, we do wear two different hats. We do advocate. And so on our website, you'll see, go to the pros and cons, and then you see those one-pagers and the 2 to 3 minute videos of presentations like what we did tonight. Go to Vote with the League, and you will be taken to a page that shows what our recommendations are. And if you enjoy this type of program, we're putting on a Vote with the League program on October 15th. That's a Saturday. You'll have your ballot in hand. You can pour a cup of coffee, sit down with your ballot, and we're going to be going through what our recommendations are, both on the state and the local measures.
Awesome, that sounds great, and another great resource. This might have been just a statement related to the conversation about parcel taxes. I'm not sure, but just the comment is parcel taxes are not flat for commercial property and not in other Bay Area cities. So
I'm not flat with the parcel tax for commercial properties is often calculated based on square footage and frontage. It has a formula. So because those would differ from commercial property to commercial property, each property has its fixed fee that it has to pay every year, but it would vary property to property because of those different dimensions, right? Whereas the residential properties are just taxed by virtue of their nature, right? There's a tax for the single family homes. If you qualify for that, it doesn't matter whether your single family home is a 1-bedroom or a 6-bedroom. You're just taxed with the fee for that category. Does that help there?
yeah, I think that helps for sure. All right, so those I think cover the questions for the local taxes. Thank you, Anna, for the link there to your website. I know we're kind of coming up on the 8:30 time. If you all are willing to stay a few more minutes, we could maybe answer a couple more of those questions from Anna's presentation earlier.
That's fine.
Okay. Okay. Great. Let me kind of scroll back up here. Back to kind of Prop 26 and 27, the gambling measures we're all a little confused about. How would the state determine who will get the money for homelessness, addiction, and mental health?
You know, I'm not exactly sure of the apportionment for various cities. Yeah, so sorry, it would be apportioned somehow to cities, but I don't know the details.
Okay, no worries.
I just wanted to mention that there's really good reason to be confused about this.
Good.
The good news and the bad news is that there were originally 4 measures on gambling, and they reduced it to 2. But that's because one set of the tribes decided they would wait till next election to bring the measure that they would want. And so there are, I don't know if we listed this, Anna, as one of the things that people say about these measures, but because we're all scratching our heads about it, doing this compare and contrast, there would have been another option for people to bring these in the legislature and to have the competing measures vetted in the legislature, and to bring just one measure to the people, or 2 clearer measures. So that was a path not taken, unfortunately.
Right. And I think a broader question is also, I don't think propositions were intended to be so complicated, right? I mean, it's one thing to have a one line that says, you know, something relatively straightforward change in the proposition, but when you have propositions that are 20, 30, 40 pages long, That's just wrong. It's just flat out wrong. And so again, there's the question of what is the proposition intended for? What should the California, what are we electing our electeds for, right? Something new like online sports betting, it's their job to kind of set up rules and so on and so forth. So there's places for a proposition and places where our electeds really should be creating the laws.
And that's kind of the really high level, people who support, people who oppose, you know. So many people who take that approach, you know, that would be their reason for opposition for virtually everything that came through the initiative process, right?
Yeah. A little bit of a similar question. So not sure if there's much more to add here, but just the pros for Prop 27 is a lot of money for homelessness, and it appears there may be no mandatory control to keep it in California. It can go anywhere. Is that correct?
I mean, this is all money that's earned in California and taxed here. But at the end of the day, if it's a nationally based company, I mean, like anything, I guess, right? If you have a beer company or anything, I guess nationally the profits would go elsewhere, but all the money is being earned and taxed here before it goes as a profit elsewhere.
But if the question is where, not about where the profits would go, but where the percentage cut out for homelessness programs, I believe those would all be within California.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Sorry.
That was a piece of the question. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense. If companies are making money off of the gambling, that obviously can go to wherever money goes, but the money that is kind of specifically set aside for homelessness would stay in California.
Yes,
correct.
Yes.
I think there were just some comments about our dialysis chat earlier that it might be about supporting workers, and that's kind of the union involvement, and a question about to be a dialysis technician without professional like medical training. Is there any kind of data on that? I'm not sure. So
it's a certification process. So dialysis technicians they have a certification process they follow, to be trained, but they are not, nurses or physician assistants or clearly doctors or, so it's a different certification that's followed for them to be able to administer that procedure.
Okay.
And that likely would not change because it's not as though adding in the supervisor with higher training or more specific training that the law would not provide that they would then be actually administering the treatment. So it's really, the change being proposed is really at the level of supervision, going from an RN to either a physician or a physician's assistant or a nurse practitioner.
Back to Prop 30, the electric vehicle proposition. Why do you think Lyft is pushing it, and why is the governor against it?
So again, Lyft has the mandate that is it 90% of the ride-sharing vehicles have to be electric. So definitely from their perspective, the larger the adoption of ZEVs, the easier it would make for them to recruit more drivers, that drive ZEVs by 2030. I can't speak specifically to the governor, but a lot of people opposing it basically say, there's a lot of money that California has and the federal government, from the Biden administration, there's a lot coming out for adoption of ZEVs. We're talking billions of dollars. So do we really need to then have yet another special tax with, interest, with money being sort of funneled that can be only used for this? Do we really want to do that?
Mm-hmm. And it's part of the broader argument about whether you change the budget. There's several measures that you'll be considering where, there's the one on music in the schools, the opponents there. There's a through line on the objections to making big budgetary changes through this process, because the budget is considered once a year, right? And if you flood, you know, the California government with all this money, it can have impacts on how much money can be allocated to other things. And so I believe that's what Newsom has articulated as his objection to this one. And part of it, I can't remember whether it was specifically his or other people's, don't want, again, this happens through these kind of propositions. The money is targeted to specific purposes. So some people would say, well, what if, you know, the federal government subsidies are sufficient, say, for the infrastructure, and we want to put money into light rail or other things that would help to reduce the carbon emissions from autos. There's not a provision for this and that. I'm not sure whether his objections extend into that arena as well, or whether they stay with the budgeting idea.
Got it. All right, several thank yous for the great presentation in the chat, and maybe a request, and again, I think you shared the website, so that's great. I think a few folks wanting maybe the link to that chart you showed.
Yes, so if you go to our website and you've got the URL for that, there's a banner that says decide, and within that banner it says see our pros and cons, and you click on the pros and cons, it will take you to that page where you can see a one-pager on each of the local measures or watch the 2 to 3 minute video. And there's also a link to the state site, which has similar one-pagers on the state measures.
Great.
So it's just one click after you land on the homepage.
Okay, I think we've touched on, maybe we have a couple more if you don't mind, and then we'll let you go and have an evening.
And Jay, if you could share that link again. I'm not able to post it to all for some reason. Yeah, that'll take you directly to that page.
Perfect, thank you. So the question is, I've read that the dialysis industry averages 16% profit. The average business is roughly 7 to 10. The argument against is supposedly that the cost will force clinics to close. Is there any information available on the average revenue of one clinic, relative salaries of RNs or PAs? So I guess, yeah, anything?
No, I don't have anything that detailed. Sorry.
Okay. And maybe the last question here, you mentioned briefly on Prop 30, something about funds going to wildfire relief. Is there anything you can clarify there?
Right, so let me just try and find the number. Yes, so from the,
I think it was $1 million, Anna, wasn't it?
right, so it's actually a percentage. So of the money raised, it would be 20% of the money raised would go to funding wildfire suppression and prevention. And the estimate is something like, at least, you know, based on the numbers they think they're going to gain now, would be something like 700 million to $1 billion for wildfire response every year.
Okay, $1 million, yeah. And I mean, sometimes on these you think like, what's the link? And it gets hard to hang on to all these things. So the unifying theme here is air quality, carbon emissions, and the effect of the fires and smoke on our air quality, as well as automobile emissions.
Yep, that makes sense. Great. Well, I think we got through everything. That was a fantastic presentation, so informative. Thank you so much, Anna and Gail, and all the work you do with the League of Women Voters. It's so appreciated. And anything else from you, Jay, before we sign off?
No, thank you. I just also want to thank Anna and Gail for the extensive research and planning and preparation to distill these complex issues down for us, and for all the work that you're doing out with the various neighborhood groups. So huge kudos. Thank you.
Yeah, such a great
You're
service.
very welcome.
Yes, very welcome.
And thanks to everybody who dialed in tonight. We had over 100 guests, attendees on the Zoom call tonight. So thank you to our community members who joined us tonight, and we hope to see you at the next meeting.
All right, thanks so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night,
Thank you.
thank you all.